Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the second Technology and Society lecture. We were very pleased to have Rashmi Dayal Chand with us for the first lecture, and today we're very excited for Bonnie Nardi and Hamid Ikbia's presentation on their book, Heteromation. And Shelley will present Bonnie and Hamid. They will present, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So Shelley, off to you.
So as Tamar said, I want to echo her words. We're delighted to welcome our two speakers. We have Professor Hamid Ikbia. He's a professor of informatics, international studies, and cognitive science at Indiana University, Bloomington. He studies the political economy of computing, the socio-philosophical foundation of AI, and the geopolitical implications of modern technology. And Professor Bonnie Nardi is a professor emeritus in the Department of Informatics in the Donald Byrne School of Information and Computer Sciences at the University of California, Irvine. She's interested in computing and political economy, along with social life on the internet, especially video gaming. So we'll have 30 minutes of presentations and then 30 minutes for Q&A. So if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand for the participants or either write in the chat to Tamar, who will take the cue. So Bonnie and Hamid, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Tamar. It's great to be here. We appreciate again, people's interest and willingness to spend the evening with us. This is going to be very informal, so please feel free to interrupt. If you have questions, raise your hand or just put something in the chat and we'll be happy to answer. Because the time is about limited, I would just start talking about heteromation and the topic, but please let me know when I have to stop. I might lose track of time, but we'll have pauses in the middle. Just in case we need to switch to the questions. So Bonnie is with me today, as you said, and we decided to just for one of us to do the presentation, and then we'll go from there. I have raised this as a kind of Shakespearean question, to automate or to heteromate, to be or not to be, whatever your favorite way of putting this is. But let me start with a quote from John Maynard Keynes, who introduced this term, technological unemployment, almost a century ago, 80 years ago, where he said that unemployment due to our discovery of means of economizing the use of labor, outrunning the pace at which we can find new uses for labor. That's how he described technological unemployment. And he also conceived of a solution, and this was his solution: a 15-hour work week. So for many ages to come, the old Adam will be so strong in us that everybody will need to do some work if he is to be contented. I apologize for the sexist language. I'm sure he meant also she. We shall do more things for ourselves than is usual with the rich today, only too glad to have small duties and tasks and routines. But beyond this, we shall endeavor to spread the bread thin on the butter, to make what work there is still to be done to be as widely shared as possible. 3-hour shifts or a 15-hour week may put off the problem for a great while. That's quite encouraging, right? So he identified the problem, and then he suggested this solution. And 80 years later, we know that this has not happened. We know that many of us are working more hours than we used in the past. So rather than 15 hours, at least in the US, I know that we work across the board many more hours than 40. I don't know about Israel. I know Europe is a bit maybe softer than the US, but I assume that you all have a similar experience. We are working more. We are spending more times with doing things. You might not call it work. You might call it something else. But we are spending a lot of time doing things. But along with that, we have this new conversation about automation anxiety. That there's this increasing worry that jobs are going to go away, and depending on where you are on the spectrum of different industries and so on, your chances of losing jobs, the risks are, might differ, but there is a risk. So this graph that was made very popular a few years ago, 2013, suggests that if you are in the food preparation industry, you have up to about 60–70% chance of losing your job in the next 20 or 30 years. That's a probability. If you are in healthcare, that's there's a lower risk, but if you are a teacher like me, the risk is even lower. That has given rise, actually, that kind of thinking has given rise to this other anticipations, predictions about, the risk of automation. And depending on where you are, again, in the world, your risk might be higher or lower, but everybody is at risk. So Israel, as you can see here, is just a bit below the average, the OECD average. And maybe, again, you can all speak to this. The US is further along in terms of GPD, but also lower in terms of risks, and so on and so forth. So I want to just, with that in the background, I want to see how much of this discourse is really based on facts, and how much of it is, is misguided based on certain wrong assumptions. And just to bring that into focus, let me share this story from Wired magazine, just from last week, where they talked about the plane paradox. And this is the title: more automation should mean more training. In other words, they have discovered that, as flight management or flying planes has become more automated, pilots are going to need more training and more experience. Because why? Because they say automation will never be a panacea for novel situations unanticipated in training. This is just actually this sentence at the bottom, to me, that's a theorem. That automation will never be a panacea for novel situations anywhere, including flying. You consider any situation, whether it is, factory work, or it is just teaching, or it is manufacturing, or it is farming, you name it. Automation will never be a panacea. And that's what we are trying to get to through this notion of heteromation. So I'm going to kind of introduce another paradox, not that plane, but this other plane. Let's call it the plane paradox, which is essentially that more automation means more labor. In other words, computation technologies, despite our, the common discourse, they do not only save labor, they create labor. That is the gist of, that's the simple idea behind our notion of heteromation. Just to make sure that we are, careful with our language, I want to suggest a few key distinctions between different words, because one source of confusion in these conversations is that people use different terms interchangeably where they really mean different things. So I'm going to distinguish between labor, work, and job. To me, and I think Bonnie would agree, labor is the human capacity to create value. That's a political economy understanding of labor. Work, on the other hand, is a much more recent thing. It is the kind of labor spent in making a living. Let's understand it that way. And jobs, which is even more recent, it's a very modern phenomenon. Wage labor, in the sense that people spending a certain number of hours earning wages, that's even more recent, goes back to maybe 200 years ago in this very broad way. So jobs are just wage labor, or wage work, more accurately. So with that terminology, these are some of the questions that we would like to ask. If computers create labor, who does the labor? And who benefits from the labor? There are different types of people, different categories of people who do the labor, from skilled professionals, software developers, programmers, UX designers, and so on. That's obviously part of this labor that is created by computers. There are wage workers who still work, for wage and do part of the work that is needed by computers, created by computers. There's this new category of gig workers, so to speak, people who move from one gig to the other, one job to the other, if you wish, one task actually more accurately to the other in order to make a living. There's what labor economists called alternative work arrangements, the types of arrangements that people usually call freelance. You are not committed to a specific job. You just, undergo, sometimes you're self-employed and so on. And of course, there's the rest of us, the so-called users. All of us are doing part of that labor. So that is the brief kind of answer to that question. And then who benefits from the labor? That's a question that we will get to in a second. But our point about heteromation is basically to speak to this very simple fact that I just introduced. So hetero, as you know, means the other. So as opposed to ado, which means the self, hetero means something that works because of the others or for the others. And there are at least three categories of others, embedded in this notion of heteromation. First is the laboring others, those who do the work, and the work that they do is typically the work that machines cannot do. There's a major reversal here in terms of, what was promised. That is, machines were supposed to do the work that we were not able to do or were not willing to do. Now the opposite is happening. We are doing the work that machines are not able to do, are not capable of doing. So that's one category of the others. The other one is deprived others, for lack of a better term. I was struggling with this, how to label this. But essentially those people who are the margins doing the work that the privileged are not willing to do. Let's call this, and as some people say, the dirty work of computing. And then finally, there is this others that are benefiting from all of this, from the other two others, the privileged, the powerful, multinational corporations, the global north at the expense of the global south, and the governments maybe. And the list could go on. So just very briefly, heteromation is meant to capture these different categories of others who are making the computer systems or enabling computer systems to work or benefiting from them. Any questions so far or comments before I get into some examples? No? Okay, so let's look at some examples. In the book, what we did, we categorized, created a typology of different types of heteromated labor, starting with this, which is, I assume, familiar to all of us. Nowadays, you go to a supermarket and you self-checkout. Essentially, what you are doing the job of somebody else who was paid before this. Some of us might like it, many of us might not, but it is something that it is growing on us, right? The same is happening in many other places, in the banks. My local bank, Chase Bank here in Bloomington, when we walked in, you saw at least 3-4 tellers sitting behind these desks that you see here in the image, right? Nowadays, when we walk in, there's nobody there. It's just, as there's a big machine, and lo and behold, people struggle still, in trying to make this work. And then these tellers who are hiding in the back room, they come and help you. I think that some version of that scenario is probably happening in your environment as well. Or when you do online banking, it's the same story, so you're doing the work that somebody else was doing for wage. We just don't call it work anymore. It's labor. Creative labor, this is an area that Bonnie is very familiar with, in gaming, for instance, people creating mods, or even, in the case of the League of Legends, kind of helping with the documentation, running the tribunal that was meant basically to adjudicate between the gamers and so on. I'm sure Bonnie can speak to this at more length if you have questions. There's this other thing which we discussed, which we named emotional labor. This robot, some of you know, is called Perot. It was created and built in Japan. Now it is finding its way in different senior care facilities around the globe. And the idea is that this is a very good kind of technology to not only entertain the elderly, but also to allow them to socialize and get, assembled together. And there's a lot of truth to that, except for the caveat that it is really not the robot that is the source of the socialization. It is the workers who work at these facilities. They have to do a lot of extra labor to bring people together. And studies after study has shown that, really what is making this possible is the extra labor of the workers, and of course the elderly, and so on and so forth. There's this other category of labor, which we can call it informating. In the book, we didn't talk about this, but it is because it's growing. I thought this is maybe deserves a different category by itself. Everything that we do nowadays, whether you are, talking to Alexa or using, the vacuum cleaner, the robotic vacuum cleaner iRobot, you are producing data that is benefiting somebody else. You're not aware of it. You don't consider it obviously work, but that's what you're doing. You're creating value, which makes this labor, from a political economy perspective. There's, as similar to that, there's what could be called the communicative labor, which is a really interesting historical novelty in the sense that this is the first time in human history that our private communications with each other have turned into a source of value for companies. No wonder some people call data the new oil. So examples of companies, famously Facebook, just to give you some numbers, many of you are in business, so this can speak to your kind of thinking, I hope. So Facebook, grew in terms of its membership between 2008 and 2013 from 130 million to 1 billion. During the same time, its revenue grew from 300 million to 4 billion. Looking at those numbers, I'm tempted to say that there's a correlation. And actually, it's not only me. Facebook itself says, in its filing in 2012, says its increases in ads or ad revenues was driven very directly by user growth. That's just, a well-established fact nowadays. Back then, maybe it was not. LinkedIn, similarly, Twitter, and so on and so forth, and many bigger and smaller companies. So there's that connection between what we do and what they get. This other new category of work, gig work, as you said, there's numerous examples, and the space is growing, from Uber and other, car hailing or ride hailing, services, to Airbnb, to Amazon Mechanical Turk, to the handyman that you hire, through crowd work, and so on and so forth. This is a growing category, and just to give you a sense of what this means, let me briefly mention, Amazon Mechanical Turk, where people do what are called microtasks. So I assume that many of you are familiar with this. So they call them human intelligent tasks, HITs, such as, for instance, tagging photos. If you are, a client and you want, a set of, let's say, 1,000 photos, 1 million photos to be tagged, computers are still very bad at that. So you post it on AMT, and then people, well, they are not volunteers anymore. They bid for this. They tag your photos, and they might get a penny or something per photo after they tag them. Many of these people are educated, but the amount that they earn is sometimes way below the minimum wage. Still, to this moment. So there's this discourse, this kind of myth that many people do this on the sidelines. This is an extra money in their pocket. It is true for some people, but that's really not true for the majority of the people who do this work. This is their only source of income, educated people. Actually, to add a twist to this, many of you probably have heard about the Venezuelan situation and US sanctions and the loss of revenue. People are desperate for jobs, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and so on. I'm talking about 2018 to the current moment. And what is happening is that Venezuelans, many of these educated people, are doing this kind of work for $2 an hour. You might say, okay, this is better than nothing, and it is, but you get the point. And then finally, there's this what could be called dirty work, such as content moderation, of people hired in the Philippines, in Pakistan, people, English-speaking people who can do this job of cleaning the mess that everybody else is creating on the internet. Hate speech, pornography, drug dealing, child pornography, fake news, you name it, right? So again, people not only earn very little from doing this, but also they go through a lot of psychological stress because they have to be exposed to this kind of content hours in a stretch, 8 hours, 10 hours, and so on. So it's not fun. The turnover is very high. People drop out very quickly, but then they come back, or other people come in because they need this kind of income. So that's as far as these different categories or types of heteromated labor are concerned. Just to add to that, in terms of how this speaks to the current work environments, I just want to briefly mention this notion of alternative work arrangements, which includes, as I said earlier, temporary help, agency workers, on-call workers, contract workers, freelancers, and so on and so forth. As it turns out, between 2005 and 2015, the number of American workers who work in this kind of arrangement rose from 10 million to 15 million. So 95% of the net employment growth in the US was in this area. And that's a huge, it's not huge in terms of absolute numbers. It is huge in terms of the trends. It is growing. And the demographics is also very interesting because the elderly are more likely to do this kind of job. Women are more likely to do this kind of job. College students are increasing in numbers, and people from the South, Hispanics, Blacks, and otherwise. So very briefly, just to summarize this, heteromated labor comes in these different types of varieties. I mean, we don't want to suggest that there is a preset group of categories, but this is just a sample of things that are happening, and it is expanding at the same time. So what we see very briefly, with technology, is this pattern when an innovation is introduced. AI nowadays, is very hot, as you all know, but the innovations typically are accompanied with limitations. They are not fully realized. So humans beings are brought into this, to fix and to overcome the limitations, but their contributions are acknowledged, or if it is acknowledged, it is minimally rewarded, and so on. We see this has happened, in the past. This is not the first time in human history where, the human beings are brought in to make up for the deficiencies of technology. But what is new is this new logic, and I just want to highlight a few aspects of what makes heteromation maybe specific and different from these earlier versions of human labor. First of all, heteromation works on this logic of what could be called inclusivity, in the sense that people are brought in, incentivized, engaged in the name of innovation and in the name of sometimes fun, gaming, you name it, which makes it very tricky because actually, when I talk to my students about this, many of you might have had a similar experience. They say nobody forces us. We go on, to Facebook, voluntarily. There's no pressure, and there's truth to that, right? But the mechanisms that attract people and engage people and keep them there are quite hideous, often, if not dangerous, in the sense that, to give you an example, there's this current debate about fake news and what the social media companies are able to do is very much driven by this logic. Because why? Because they benefit from keeping us online as long as they can, right? What types of content keep people online? Well, unfortunately, provocative, sensational content. And there's no way that these media companies are going to be able to give that up, because that's their bottom line, right? So what I can do is essentially to keep the same game going in this very paradoxical way. So that logic is very pervasive, the logic of inclusivity, and it is very hidden because it's difficult to basically to make the argument that this is really driven by profit or by other motivations that do not necessarily align with your interests. So it is also invisible for that matter, because it is not as obvious as good old Marxist exploitation. And that's one reason that we think that we needed this terminology, because the mechanisms are different. This is a new kind of way of extracting value from human labor that is different from wage labor. And it is done with this rhetoric of innovation and so on and so forth. So in a sense, heteromation could be understood as a new logic of accumulation of wealth, where human value still remains the source of economic creation and value creation, but not necessarily through wage labor. That doesn't mean that capitalism has left classes and we live in a classless society, as some people suggest. Classes are still there. It's just the formations, as some people have suggested, that are changing. And as I said, in the previous slide, the logic is different because now people are included as opposed to excluded from these systems through this logic of inclusivity. So in a sense, heteromation picks up when dispossession leaves off. Dispossession, as many of you know, was this term that people such as Karl Marx introduced in order to say how people were deprived of their means of production and labor, the products of their labor. And heteromation is just a next up kind of step in that historical trajectory. I don't know how much time we have left. I would like to stop here, pause, and see if people have any questions. If there's time, we can get into that other question of how did we get here, what happened so suddenly in 10, 15 years. But if you don't mind, let me pause for now.
So would you like us to take a few questions and then maybe continue?
Yes, by all means, yes. And Bonnie is of course here, so.
Terrific. Maybe I'll just use my prerogative for a second, just an observation that came up from your presentation, that there's this tech washing here, right? The platforms are washing this exploitation of service providers by saying we're just providing the platform. We're not the ones dispossessing these workers or service providers, but effectively they are this new marketplace that does exactly that. It's very capitalist. So I want to invite everyone to raise their hands or write to me in the chat if they have a question, but I already have a first question from Shachar. So Shachar, go ahead.
Hi, it's a pleasure to meet you. Okay, my question is this. As a customer living in the digital age, and I want the technologies know me better, and I actually say this very carefully. So do not think that the dirty work is actually worth it. Economics law say that whoever offers the highest price will get the produce. What do you think about it? What am actually the customers missing here?
Bonnie, you want to take that?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So every person in the world knows that we have a smartphone and we can actually just take the smartphone and do everything you want. And you say that is a dirty word or people who do behind this. So maybe in high and a lot of people actually say, okay, so it's worth it. The dirty word is worth it.
I mean, I'm going to throw that one back to you.
Yeah, sure. So if I understand the question correctly, you say, okay, yes, it is dirty work, but it is a dirty work that has value. It is worth it, right? And yes, of course it is worth it, but the question is for whom, right? There is, by way of analogy, we create mess in our environment. Most fundamentally, we create material mess. We create dirt, we create garbage, right? And somebody has to clean that up. Historically, that has been the case. Janitors, for instance, right? The question is, so there are two things, what is new about this? First of all, the promise of technology was that technology is going to do the dirty work. We are going to do the fun work. That if you listen to Maynard Keynes, 80 years ago, that was the idea that, technology is going to allow us to become a real human, do the creative work. And then the rest is going to be done, the dirty, the boring, the repetitious, the dangerous jobs are going to be done by technology. That is not what is happening. It is the opposite. Most often, and this is just one example, content moderation is just one example. So what happened to that promise? And here is where people might differ in terms of how they respond to the question, right? You might say technology is simply not able to do this, and there's some truth to that. Technology is still not able to do some of this work. But I think the bigger truth is that the resources, the money is invested in areas that are not addressing these problems, right? Potentially, technology could have been, dedicated to doing the boring and the dirty job. But unfortunately, that's not where the income for these corporations comes from. Hence, as long as there is this, cheap labor around the globe in Pakistan or the Philippines, why should I, spend my resources if I'm Facebook or Google? Why should I spend my resources improving that? I can hire these other people. And that is what is happening. I don't know if that answered your question, but
it is. But so isn't it possible to create a balance, something we can outward it?
Well, the balance would be, in an ideal world, would be that, that people are going to be, if it is inevitable for this kind of job to be done by people, they should get, the right type of income, the right type of benefits, the right type of protections, and so on, which is why, many of you are in law, and I understand, law and regulations are going to be very important here. Unfortunately, most of this kind of labor is done in places where there is minimal protection. So these multinational corporations can do things in these places that they cannot possibly do in the US. So that adds an extra pain, an extra level of, exploitation. It adds insult to injury, if you wish, right? That these people have to do the dirty work, and not only they are not paid well and they are not acknowledged, right? Nobody is protecting them.
I got it. Thank you.
I would add to that it's not just in the global south that this is happening. Heteromation isn't even recognized as a category of labor. And so the idea that there should be protections, despite the fact that you have people working on Amazon Mechanical Turk, for whom that is their job, that is their livelihood, people don't recognize it as real work. And so we don't have any laws or protections. In the US, you can ask people to do things literally for a penny, and nobody will tell you not to do that. So I think the problem is, as Hamid said, but maybe even bigger.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Ruth, and then Shelly.
Yes, please. My question is, which labor category would you say is most problematic, in which people get most exploited? Is it the communicative labor by corporates like Facebook?
So let me just briefly answer that, and then Bonnie, I'm sure, can take it from there. Let me translate problematic into a different language, because it depends on the scope. So one meaning of problematic is how big is which category, right? So the communicative labor is the biggest because everybody is participating in it. All of us are creating value without knowing, in our homes, in our bedrooms, in our kitchens. You know that people, these are now pretty much in evidence that, for technical reasons, companies such as Google and Facebook and so on are literally listening in to your conversations, not for the purpose of eavesdropping, but because they need to train their systems through your conversations. So there's that fact. So in terms of scope and its ubiquity, I think perhaps communicative labor is the biggest one, because we are just being bombarded. That's maybe behind this idea of the surveillance capitalism of Zuboff. You see what I mean? But just the point is that that's just one minor chunk of it. It is very vast in scope, but in terms of the level of exploitation, I would say that these other categories might be not as widespread, but maybe more dangerous, such as content moderation. Bonnie.
Yeah, that is a really good question, and I think Hamid gave a good answer. What always concerns me about heteromation is how easy it is to do anywhere in any industry, as long as you have a computing infrastructure. And so it becomes incredibly ubiquitous. And the value of the labor keeps going to, a very small number of people. And I don't think we're really addressing that. How much power does Jeff Bezos really need to have? Or Elon Musk, or these people that are just massively rich, and with that money comes power. And how do we as a society deal with that? And heteromation is just everywhere. Every time I turn over a rock, there it is. So that's the kind of thing that kind of keeps me awake.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shelley and then Noam.
Okay, so this is more of a comment, and first let me say that this was truly fascinating, and I also, as I said to you before, really enjoyed the book. The labor framing, I think, helps us see the capitalist story that is incredibly important, and it's eye-opening. But I wanted to add that there are some of the stories, especially when we think about communicative labor, are also stories about communities, relationships, good and bad, and identities. And so there are also property stories. Now, I'm taking a legal perspective for a moment. So if we think through the lens of labor, we can discuss benefits and unions and vocational training. But if we think about contributions and the contributing participation as property, we may even think about the power to continue to participate. So even if the platform decides to block me or to be compensated when the activity ends, and it may end not just by me being blocked from the platforms, but also if it shuts down or changes its business model. So I see it as, so my point here is that I see it not only as changing labor, when it comes to communicative labor, but it is also profoundly changing property and making property dependent on others, and these others are these big platforms.
Right, a quick comment on that, and then I'll let Bonnie speak to this. This is more at the same time anthropological question, so she's more qualified. But in terms of labor, I want to make an invitation to those of you who are in law, and to basically to this. I've been in conversation with law people for the last few years in different places, and this is an invitation to really to do what Shelley is implying. That is that law, in the sense that it is siloed between labor and property and and civil and so on, is not going to be able to address the problems that we are facing, because, as Bonnie just said, heteromation is all over the place. So in order for law to be able to deal with this, these silos have to be broken. Actually, different parts of law have to speak to each other, because you cannot separate, at the moment, to think about the Airbnb. Is this about labor or is it about property? Think about Uber. Is this labor or is it property? Think about, your data. Is it civic or is it labor? And so on and so forth. So I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to invite legal scholars among you to think about how these bridges could be made between different areas of law. Bonnie, sorry.
Yeah, no, I picked up on one thing that was said there, which was you join these communities and then suddenly the software isn't there anymore. This happens in video gaming communities. There was this one very interesting study of these older women who were very isolated and joined a community where they would make these little virtual pets, but they also had each other in the community. And then the company wasn't making enough money, and so they shut it down. And these women were just bereft. And so much community, I think, does happen online now. And it feels very fragile to me. And I don't know if it's property or identity. I don't know what it is, but it feels incredibly fragile. And I think it's problematic that we're putting so much of our energy into these very virtual spaces. And I still kind of keep my eye on video games, and I see this a lot. Now there's a positive aspect too. I belong to this sort of little club. It's called a guild. And some of the people in the guild are very marginal. They're quite sick, or they're kind of crazy. And this is the place they come to. And I always worry, what if this video game closes down? You know, what will happen to these people that I know that are, for whom this is their social lifeline?
Thanks so much. Noam.
Thank you. You talked about two parts. One part was the exploitation, let's say, of new kind of workers that make that are not compensated enough, and this is like a problem that we know also from like beginning of mass industry, and it could be solved maybe on the basis of history. But what I wanted to ask was about the second part that involves all of us. Like we get these school services and applications, and we sell our information. We give our information. And what I wanted to ask is whether you have some kind of notion about what mechanisms should or could change that. Like, should we ban using private information unless we sell it? Or I don't know, like, is there anything that could, or it will just stay the same?
Great question. The answer is difficult. Let me just preface that by saying that you're putting your finger on a very important distinction. And in the book, actually, we were mostly focused on what nowadays I would describe as heteromated use, meaning that we were focused on, people's contribution to these technologies through just their simple use, all of us. But then increasingly we are noticing, and that's what Bonnie was hinting at, increasingly noticing that the same mechanisms are at work elsewhere in the labor space, in the workspace, and so on and so forth. But still, that distinction is useful. So I would suggest, first of all, as a starting point, just in terms of the terminology, to distinguish between heteromated use and heteromated labor. So use is for somebody who is doing, you go to Facebook, you use Google and so on, and you're not doing this for any income, right? You are incentivized by other things. They might not be known to you, but you have other reasons to do this, right? These things. As opposed to somebody who does work on the Amazon Mechanical Turk, or, on these other platforms, crowd work, whatnot, they do this for an income. Now, the mechanisms that attract people to these different platforms, of course, are different, as we just said, right? But what is common among them is the fact that, that we are trying to highlight, that all of this was supposed to be done by, by technologies, by machines. And because machines are limited, are incapable, of doing this, human beings find themselves doing this other work, which is actually, the reversal of what was promised. That reversal is very important in both cases, in the sense that we were, as we said, supposed to do the fun, the creative work, and the machines were supposed to do the rest of it. The opposite is happening. And that is what is damaging. Now, how can we deal with this? That's a long story. I'm not claiming that we have a solution. At least I don't have a solution, but I think, a lot of it actually relies on laws and regulations. I think that the legal community, the legislative, authorities, but for lack of a better term, they carry a great deal of responsibility in fixing this situation. Bonnie?
Yeah, I have a slightly different answer. Well, it's probably really different. Heteromation and many other things like environmental destruction really lead me to question whether capitalism is working at all. So we find heteromation and says, it's just like, it's brilliant of capitalism to come up with this new way to get money for itself that is like, it's almost like printing money, because we sit at our computers and generate all this value, and billions literally of people do this. And yet we still find, the mentally ill people without services. We still find all the problems in the global South, all the things we've been talking about. Should we start reimagining the economy and like really questioning what we're doing? We're all privileged, we've all benefited, literally everyone in this virtual room, and we're doing fine. But many people are not doing fine, and it's a huge global problem. So I've come to the conclusion that, and COVID kind of pushed me toward this too, what we really need to do is really start thinking about this system that we're all embedded in. And I do not have any idea how to materially change it, but if we don't, we're going to get more of the kind of inequality we have, more of the environmental destruction, and heteromation is one symptom, I think, of this. So I think it's really incumbent on all of us to think about what the hell are we doing in this system, and how do we start trying to reimagine it?
That's a call to revolution, and I couldn't agree more with it. I mean, it's not call to arms necessarily, but I totally agree with that. But I just
second that too.
I just don't know how. That's the problem. How to do this. Having been through this, at least for my age, a couple of times.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now to Yossi Dahan, who's the head of our Human Rights Program.
Hi, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I want to continue Bonnie's remark in the sense of there are two levels of solutions. One is the infrastructure, the economic, political economic infrastructure, which is capitalism, okay? If we are going to tinker with this regulation or this rule on this, the logic is much stronger than this regulation, and above all, they usually control the regulation. They control the production of rules and laws. So I agree, and there are all kinds of alternatives to liberal capitalism, some social democratic ones, some socialists that are thinking about cooperative, industrial democracy, and all this kind of thing, which are a very high abstract level. But now we go to the lower level, and a few remarks. One remark is that it's interesting when you talk about all these people who are doing this dirty work. It reminds me of a recent discussion about essential workers in the COVID. Okay, who are the essential workers? Who were the essential workers? Okay, who were the cashier in the supermarket, the bus driver, and all these people? And they were doing they were undercompensated. They're low wages, very essential to our survival. And in this sense, I think here again, you have all these people doing the essential work. Jeff Bezos is not running in the warehouses, okay? He's not doing the essential work. He's a capitalist, and I guess he has he deserves some compensation for his ideas. So it's the same problem. Second remark is that some of the problem that you mentioned, again, to go to, for example, labor law, there are some solutions. For the example, you talk about gig workers, so independent contractors. So you have this all kinds of labor solution. Let's give them a new, they should be considered as workers, okay? With all the rights that accompany the status of workers, so that they'll have all the compensations that the workers do. And there was this in California. There was this what's the call, number 54. What?
Proposition 24.
Right, our Uber workers or independent contractors, and it was defeated. Another solution, which is different, it's very popular, and it comes from a different angle, and the angle is the end of work. So automation is going to basically destroy or eliminate a lot of jobs. So let's go for universal income for, okay? And so we'll give everybody a certain income, and this will give them some freedom, okay? Freedom of choice in the labor market. They can be, it has a feminist perspective because you give some independence to women when you give them an independence of source of income. And it has all this kind of advantages. It's supposed, for example, to work also for some of the people that you mentioned.
Yeah, so that's really interesting that you bring those up, because that's kind of what I've been thinking, is that we can't really have a revolution. We don't know how to do that if we ever did. But what we can do is start taking these fairly radical ideas like the universal basic income. In the US, defunding the police is something we need to do, and put those resources into social work and other areas. And that would, if we had a universal basic income, I think that would do a lot toward kind of cutting capitalism off at the knees, because the reason people work now is because, at least in the US, they don't have healthcare, they don't have money to pay the rent. And so they have to kind of give their lives over to work that isn't really very pleasant, so that a few people can be incredibly rich. But what if you could just stay home and garden and make quilts, whatever it is that you like to do, and your basic needs would be provided for? Maybe we would get out of this cycle of overconsumption and overwork. I love the idea of people not having to work as hard as they do now. And that would really radically transform. And in California, we are starting experiments, and many other places too, with the universal basic income. So it's 2 years ago, it would have seemed completely outlandish. Now it's like, okay, yeah, it's something we can try. And if an idea like that starts at sort of a low level, it might really kind of explode and then transform the system. So Hamid, to your comment about revolution, that's sort of how I see the revolution happening, is through ideas exactly like this. Just, you know, it's like in biological evolution, I think they call it punctuated equilibrium, like things are going along and then suddenly, boom, there's this huge change and the whole system really changes. I can imagine that happening to our economic system.
Yeah, actually lawyers have a similar term. They call it a watershed moment. That is, maybe we are at that moment. Everything that is happening in the US points in that direction. The only problem is that we don't know which direction it's going to take. You know, it might go for the worse. I know there's some reasons to be pessimistic about this, but there are also good reasons to believe that it might be the opposite. Again, I agree that some fundamental changes have to take place. We just don't know where and how.
Right. Now on to Gila Stopler, our Dean.
So thank you very much for a really, really interesting presentation and discussion, because I think these are really highly important and complex questions. And I just want to, because you covered so much in your, both in your presentation and in the discussion now. This is basically, what do we do in this technological globalized world with all the bad things that, that technology and globalization bring to us, even though they bring good things at the same time. And I think that, trying to just to conceptualize the difference between the different topics that you raised, I think one of the ways to do that is by thinking about free choice versus protected classes, because, for example, Shahar's question at the beginning was, look, this is my free choice. This is what I do. What do you want? If I choose to give all my private information to Facebook, what do you want from me? This is my constitutional right, right? But then we have those protected classes, which we have already agreed, for example, like minimum wage workers and much less than minimum wage workers, that we've agreed that we must protect. So I think what we need here, like in this watershed moment, is to have a shift in our understanding of what is really, are we really in a free choice situation? What really are we giving up to all those companies? And that's like the next level. I mean, we don't even protect those who are supposed to be protected classes. But once we get past that, we also have the question of protecting ourselves from what is allegedly our free choice, but in truth is far from it.
Bonnie, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually feel really encouraged that we're talking about things like watershed moments. 5 years ago, I wasn't hearing this kind of thing. Maybe COVID did it to us, I don't know. But the fact that we're willing to say, wait a minute, let's look at our system and see what we're actually doing. And I don't have the answers, but I think together we will, eventually find them. I think that's really important. And it makes me feel optimistic that we still have a chance to hopefully create a better system.
And I also agree that we have to go to those basic questions. Is it Gila? Am I right, or Gila? Gila. Was pointing out, right, that this notion of freedom of choice is, with apologies to liberal colleagues, it's a big lie that has been sold to us, for more than 100 years or 200 years and so on. It's time maybe to revisit that. It is abuse. It's funny that some of these languages, this kind of thinking emerged with a very positive, productive, angle to them, and now they have been hijacked. In the U.S., at least, I know for a fact that that the language of choice is very much abused, for conservative purposes, agendas and so on and so forth. So it's really not going that far. But it's useful to revisit and say, where did this come from? Privacy is similar, actually, to be honest with you. I think the notion of privacy is all, as it is understood now and it is debated, it is just a very liberal notion of the right to be left alone. Or, maybe that's not adequate anymore in addressing the question that was raised at the beginning. If people are willing to do this, maybe we should rethink even the notion of privacy. So I agree with you. Those fundamental questions are really important.
Thank you so much, Hamid and Bonnie, for this really fascinating discussion and presentation. I'm afraid we're just out of time, but I'd like to encourage the students here to pick up the book and read if they're interested in figuring out more about heteromation. And I hope we'll have another chance to do this soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was
Thank
really
you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, really good questions. Thank you, everyone, so much. Okay, take care.
Good night and good morning to you over there.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.